My name's Margaret Horvath, and I will be your technical assistant today. This session is being recorded and will be available on the TDSB website at www.tdsb.on.ca. To ensure a smooth session for all attendees, we have enabled both the Q&A and the chat function, muted all participants, and prevented screen sharing. If you want to open the Q&A or the chat functions, simply click on that icon. We request that both spaces be used in a way that creates a safe and a respectful environment for all to engage. If you are calling into the session, please use *9, the raise hand function, and the moderator will try to get to your question. Next step is audio and microphone. The audio quality of this session is based on your individual bandwidth. If you're worried about slow internet connection, you can call in by using the dial-in information included in the invite. The invite is located at www.tdsb.on.ca under the heading Latest News. If for some reason your speaker's bandwidth becomes unstable and things become choppy, please bear with us. We'll hear it too, and we will work as quickly as possible to resolve the issue. You may exit or change the full screen speaker or gallery view by clicking the top right button or View Options drop-down menu. Lastly, there will be a quick survey and a poll for you to complete before leaving the webinar. I've put the link to the polls in the chat. Now, to get things started, I'm going to hand it over to Dee Williams, your co-chair for the Parent Involvement Advisory Committee, more commonly known as PIAC. Over to you, Dee.
Hi there, welcome. So I'd just like to welcome everyone to this session and just start off with the TDSB land acknowledgement. We acknowledge we are hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also acknowledge the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. So I'm also to introduce is Associate Director Colleen Russell Rollins on the line yet? Perfect. That is like the perfect timing. So I'd just like to first of all introduce Colleen Russell Rollins, Associate Director of Equity, Wellbeing, and School Improvement at TDSB.
Thank you very much, Dee, and thank you for being the chair of PIAC and working with us to offer this exciting program to parents and caregivers this evening. Thank you to everyone who has joined us. This is the third in a series of conversations about topics that impact your child's well-being. Tonight's dialogue with our esteemed panel focuses on talking about race with children. What an important topic in this moment, and in fact has always been an important topic for parents to speak about with their children. We know children learn to detect racial differences as young as 6 months old, and by ages 2 to 4, children can internalize racial bias. Once as a classroom teacher, I recognized that in our kindergarten classrooms. I think we have to be honest about the internalized bias that our children have. For many Black and other equity-seeking groups of people, these conversations about race happen early and often. For others, it may be in response to something that happened at school or in the community. What we know now, and what is so clear to us given what is happening in the world around us, is that if we want our children to live in a socially just world, we must be proactive in talking with them and educating them about race and racism in all its forms, including anti-Black racism, and anti-Indigenous racism and colonization, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and other forms of discrimination. So I'm very grateful to the panel this evening for facilitating this conversation. I know it will be a challenging conversation, but an insightful conversation. I would like to now turn it over to Trustee Rachel Chernos-Lynn, who serves as a liaison to PIAC. Thank you very much. Over to you, Trustee Chernos-Lynn.
Thank you very much, Associate Director, for that introduction. So as mentioned, my name is Rachel Chernos-Lynn, and I'm the trustee for Ward 11 and also the representative trustee on PIAC. Tonight, I'm pleased to introduce the third and final webinar that we will be hosting this week. All of the topics for these webinars have been chosen based on direct feedback from parents and guardians at the TDSB. And tonight's topic, Talking Race with Your Children, is certainly one that many parents have been requesting, especially in light of recent events in North America. Equity, well-being, and student success are all important pieces of our multi-year strategic plan here at the TDSB. We know we cannot achieve these goals without significant work around anti-oppression training and without transforming the nature of the education system. This includes things like de-streaming, interrupting our student discipline structure, and much more. As a school board, it is important that we listen to our communities. It helps us make informed decisions, and it also helps us to provide support and guidance where needed. And through the Equity Task Force, undertaken a couple years ago, we learned a tremendous amount from our TDSB community about what needed to change, ideas that have been brought up again loud and clear in the last month. And so tonight, we look forward to an engaging evening where we hope to address parent concerns related to talking to their children about race. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce this evening's co-moderators, Michelle Monroe and Floydine Charles Friedel. Michelle is a social work practitioner and coordinator of parent and community engagement with the TDSB for the past 15 years. She has worked in the field of public education and public service for over 20 years, delivering anti-oppressive, anti-bias, and anti-Black family and community engagement. Michelle is a trained facilitator, public speaker, and presenter. And in her role with the Parent and Community Engagement Office, Michelle works closely with PIAC. And so I have the wonderful luck to work closely with her as the trustee appointed to PIAC for the last couple of years, and know we are in good hands tonight. Michelle is also the mother of 2 girls and resides in the GTA. Floydine Charles Friedel has been a powerful advocate for the Black community in Toronto for many years. The recipient of many awards, including the Joe Leonard and the Harry Jerome Awards, Floydine is a founding member of Taibu Community Health Center and is currently serving as Executive Director of Caribbean African Canadian Social Services. A few weeks ago, Toronto Public Health declared anti-Black racism in Toronto a public health crisis. It should be noted that Floydine was instrumental in making this happen, advocating in this regard for quite some time and appearing before the Toronto Public Board of Health in the fall of 2019 to dispute on this very issue. In doing a bit of research, I also learned that Floydine was the first Black woman to earn a black belt from the Young Ho School of Taekwondo in Florida, and eventually went on to become state champion in the sport. Needless to say, we are in great hands tonight with our 2 moderators. Over to you, Michelle and Floydine.
Thank you, Trustee Lynn. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to turn the floor over first to Floydine.
Good evening, everyone. How are you? Can you hear me?
Yes, but we can barely see you. We're seeing the top of your head. Thank you for joining us.
Can you see
Just
me
a slight
now?
adjustment of your camera, please.
Pardon me?
Just a slight adjustment of your camera, and then we're good to go.
I'm on my phone, so I don't know how to. Hold on. Let me see how I can.
If not, what we'll do, we'll hear you. There you go. Perfect. Thank you.
Can you see me now? Okay.
Yes.
I am going to start by reading a statement of truth. Just give me, I'm not so good at this.
We're all in the learning journey of the technology, Floydine.
Geez. Sorry. I don't know how to switch between my screen and, okay. So this is just an introduction, a statement of truth, and it speaks the truth to Black settlers' experiences. Our significant presence and contributions on this land predate the country of Canada by over 115 years. Indeed, up until 1961, over half of Black people in Canada were Indigenous to Canada. Indigenous settlers to Canada includes your ancestors. Learn of that. Our sweat, skills, experiences, and contributions taken and used without consent and for free built and shaped early Canada. Learn of that. For example, Viola Desmond has undoubtedly pushed and carved Canada into the powerful promise that it is today. Learn of that. People of African descent are resilient, brave, spiritual, and master builders who have been centralized to the campaign for equality, equity, and an equitable Canada. The new goal is African Canadian truth-telling, starting today. Learn of this. Ashe. I just wanted to take this opportunity before we go in my role as now in light of what has happened today in terms of the results that we are experiencing from the case of Devontae Miller. That while we speak and the world is now responding to the experiences of anti-Black racism in the recent part, this has been our ongoing lived experience. It has been an experience as we talk about race and racism, and that when we speak with our children about race and racism, to understand that the lived and living experience of people of African descent has been ongoing since time immemorial and in this country. So I believe that as we have this conversation today and we talk about how we talk to children about race, it's important for them to also understand that in this country, that racism has manifested itself, has been an experience here even before Canada became a country, and what that means to us now. I think the fundamental difference is the unrelenting trauma and experiences of trauma that we are experiencing, that in conversations with our children, that we speak to them in the way in which they understand it and learn it, and how at an early age they can be taught how to even mitigate it in their own environment around their peers. So I also want to take this opportunity to thank you all for allowing me to be part of this conversation, a very necessary one, and one that I hope will take us to another level of dialogue and action. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Floydine. So as we now prep for this dialogue, I want to just quickly, Malatha, would you go to the next slide, please? Just do an emotional weather forecast, which is an opportunity where I ask you to just check in onto where you are, where you're thinking, how you're feeling, how you're doing, and you pay attention to the space that you're in and how you're feeling. And just a gentle reminder, next slide, that usually when we're entering spaces, we're in a very comfortable place. We're in our comfort zones, we're feeling good, but I want us to keep in mind that while our comfort zone is a comfortable place, very little grows there. Sometimes in order for us to stretch our thinking, we need to open ourselves up to the possibility, and the possibility requires us to step out of that comfort zone and that space. In order to do that, next slide, Latha, sometimes we need to sit in places of discomfort. So I ask as we begin this conversation, if there are places of discomfort, if there's something that you see that is said, that somehow your body begins to do a little shift and you're feeling a little something, I ask that you just stay in it for a moment. You do some self-inquiry, you ask yourself as to what is it that I'm feeling? What is it that's making me curious? What is it that's making me feel uncomfortable? And I just ask you to sit in that discomfort. One thing we've learned about that discomfort, if we're able to pay attention to it, talk ourselves through it, our body will eventually adjust to it. The feeling will pass, and then we'll get to the next slide, which will take us to what I call that aha moment, which is an opportunity for learning and an opportunity for growth. And we want that growth to happen this evening throughout our conversation. And so I ask you to just sit in that place. I also ask that as we have this conversation, that the chat is open to you, and we want to see you use the chat, but we want to ensure that you're using the chat in a safe way. The guideline for the chat is do no harm this evening, right? We want it to be a safe space where you can express yourself, where others can express, and all thoughts can be shared. So without further ado, let us get to the purpose for this evening. We have some esteemed, oh, thank you, Latha. Go ahead with that. I don't want to miss that. So this evening, these are some of the terms and definitions that you're going to be hearing as we move throughout the evening. What I want you to do is, anyone online, if you know what either of these words mean, I want you to get to your chat, and I want you to start sharing definitions with each other. I was going to give them to you, and I thought, you know what? Let us start working with each other, sharing with each other, provide us content and information that we need so we can start the chat in an informative way. So take a look at those terms. If you know what it means, start chatting it. All right? Thank you. So now we move to our esteemed panelists that we have this evening, and we're looking forward to a great talk. Just skip that slide, Latha, and move to Dr. Kang Lee. Dr. Kang Lee, he's the professor and Tier 1 Canada Research Chair. Dr. Kang Lee with the University of Toronto. He is also Senior Scientist, Professor Rank, Department of Psychology with the University of California, California, San Diego, I'm sorry. He has mainly two focused on areas in terms of his research. The first is the development of social perception with a specific focus on face processing. For over 2 decades, he has used behavioral and neuroscience methods to examine how infants, children, and adults process own versus other faces, other race faces, and the linkage between face perception and racial biases. Currently, Dr. Lee's lab is exploring how to reduce racial biases in childhood. Without further ado, Dr. Lang, we'll turn it over to you. Could we get your microphone on? Dr. Lang, Dr. Lee?
Yes, let me share the screen. Okay, let me see. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me to this evening to talk about racial biases and how we can combat that. I want to give you a little bit history account of psychological research for racial biases and how to reduce them. So let me see. Okay, oops. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm going to. And then the first book is by Gordon Allport in the early 1950s. So he summarized the about 20 years of work before him. And if you read this book, you would find out what exists then, mostly in the United States and Canada, and continue to exist today. So nothing really has changed. And then his discoveries and the others' discoveries made then about the development of racial bias and racial bias among adults and continue to exist today. The only scientific development over the last 70 or something years is this. This is the book. If you want to take a look or to buy it, it will be really a good book to read. It's called Blind Spot by 2 researchers. One is Tony Greenwald from University of Washington and Mahzarin Benaji from Harvard University. They discovered a new kind of racial bias in addition to the racial biases that Gordon Allport was talking about. So what are these biases? So basically, there are 2 kinds of biases now we know. One is called the explicit racial bias. It has 3 components. One is stereotypes, basically some kind of no generalized views we have about a certain race. For example, when I was in the United States, my colleagues always assumed I was good at math. And they say Asians are good at math. So this is an overgeneralized notion about the race or ethnicity. And next one is prejudice. That's the attitudes, negative attitudes against certain kind of racial groups. And then the third one, discrimination. That is the way, the actions you have taken to do something based upon race. For example, you criminalize certain racial groups more than the other groups. There are many, many these kind of examples, and we have seen lately. So this is just the tip of the iceberg, however. So what the new discoveries in psychological science is this, the implicit racial bias. These are the biases that we actually have, but we are not aware of. And then again, these biases include stereotypes, prejudices, and discriminations. And all these biases, explicit or implicit, actually would have a negative impact on in all spheres of human life, including politics, law, employment, health, education, science, and data. So I'm not going to spend time talk about this negative impact that they would have on racialized groups, for example, in Canada or in the United States. I just want to give you one example that you may not be aware of. So in the United States, there's a strong scientific evidence to show that medical doctors, when they, particularly white medical doctors, when they prescribe painkillers to their patients, they tend to give less painkillers to Black people, Black patients, because they assumed they can tolerate pain more than white people. And a friend of mine at the University of Virginia did a study with 5-year-old white children, and they already had the same view as the white doctors. So this is just one very, very small example of how some of the biases we have, implicit or explicit, would impact on our everyday lives, and things that you may be aware of and then things you're not aware of at all. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I want to show you a picture. So in this picture, this is the picture actually used in racial bias training classes in the US police departments. So I want you don't have to tell me how you respond to this, but you tell yourself, what is your very first reaction to the picture I'm going to show you? Like, what is the story here in the first second? Okay, are you ready? Okay, let me show you the next one, okay? So what is your first gut reaction to this picture? So I'm going to tell you how in the United States, most of the police officers' response are. Regardless if they are Black, white, Hispanic, these are police officers. They say, of course, this is a police officer arresting a Black criminal, okay? But this picture can be easily the other way around. That is, this white guy is holding up this Black innocent person on the street. So the white person is actually a robber, and the Black person is a victim. However, when you show these pictures to people on the street or in the police department, that was not their reaction. Their first reaction, gut reaction, is that the white person is arresting the Black person. So what is this? This is the bias. So it could be explicit bias, could be implicit bias. Okay. Anyhow, so if you want to test whether or not you have implicit biases, you should go to this website called the Harvard University Project Implicit. So this is a great website. You actually can find out a lot about yourself, your biases, without by going through the tests. So they actually looked at all sorts of biases you have, about skin tone biases, gender biases, and your biases against transgender individuals, your biases against religion, age, and racial biases, of course. So, and then it's a really a very good website for you as adults, as parents, to find out whether or not you already have certain kind of bias, in particular racial biases, okay? It would be, you know, very make you self-aware of the biases you have that you actually do not know before today. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just answer a bunch of questions based on what I know about the existing scientific evidence. So I'm going to answer these questions as I'm asking them. So the first question is, at which age do children begin to show explicit racial biases? So the answer is about 3 years of age. So at 3 years of age, children actually show very strong racial biases in favor of own race against other races. That's number one. And at which age do children begin to show implicit racial biases? And the work from my lab showed that children as young as about 9 to 10 months of age already show implicit racial biases. And then the next question is, do parents play any role in the development of racial biases in children? So you will be very surprised. So the extensive research showed parents actually play very limited role in the formation of children's implicit and explicit racial biases. So the children's racial biases are highly unlikely to come in from parental explicit teaching to them. So in some communities, possibly in the United States, you may have these parents who are very explicitly racial biased, and then they teach their kids against other race individuals. But this is very, very rare. But majority of the time, parents actually do not, parents' racial biases are not very highly correlated with children's racial biases. And then next question is, do children's cognitive development play any role? That is their development of intellectual abilities, their ability to control, self-control, or things like that. And turns out these factors actually play an important role in children's development of racial biases. And also children's moral development actually is a very important protective factor for children to develop explicit racial biases against other race individuals. And then the last question is, are there any effective methods to reduce racial biases? So you'll be very surprised. So research on this has been ongoing for over 70 years. Almost no method is going to have lasting effects. Most of the methods are useless. And there are few methods, they are useful, and we still don't know quite well how long these methods will last. The longest lasting effect that a method has produced is about 40-some days. Okay, just keep that in mind. So you can ask me questions afterwards why I'm saying what I'm saying. So let me give you a few examples. So this is, so you say, how do you know babies are racially biased? So this is a study. So I'm going to show you a bunch of studies that I did actually in China. The reason I did the studies in China for two reasons. One is in China, there's a rampant racism in China, and there's rampant anti-Black racism in China, implicit or explicit. So that's for one reason. Another reason is in China, the majority of the kids in China would have no exposure to other race individuals. So that creates a very nice homogeneous research environment for us to isolate the rural experience in children's formation of racial biases. So in this particular case, I'm going to show to you is we showed children music and the own race faces. This is the happy music, own race faces, and sad music, happy face, own race faces, or happy music, other race faces, or sad music, other race faces. And we then look at how children learn to associate between the music and faces. Turned out children just very readily associate own race faces with happy music and other races with sad music. And on top of that, we also taught children to follow the gaze of own race or other race individuals to learn about things in the world. And we discovered that the babies about 10 months of age would like to learn from own race individuals. They don't like to learn from other race individuals. And then here's another one we did with about 4 or 5-year-olds. So in this particular study, you can see there's on your left-hand side is a typical Chinese face, and on your right-hand side is a typical African face. But then what we did was we put them the face together to create a hybrid face, 50% Chinese, 50% African. But then we put a little bit of smile to the face, that's the top face, and a little bit of anger to the bottom face. Then we show this to Chinese 4 and 5-year-olds. And to our surprise, Chinese 4 and 5-year-olds believed that the person who's smiling is Chinese and the person's angry in the middle, and the ambiguous face, racially ambiguous angry face is black. So this finding has been replicated in many places with adults as well. So adults, when they look at the ambiguous race faces, if the person's angry, they think it's black. But if the person's smiling, they think it's their own race. So these are all the implicit and explicit racial biases at play when we process the faces. So then you would ask, the kids are so young, where do they get this kind of ideas? And turns out that one of the fundamental idea they got from is not from their parents, but from their environment. Because when babies are born, they are born into an environment that they see mostly their own race faces. And because of this, and then they gradually develop positive associations with own race individuals and negative association with other race individuals. So some of you may say, babies 9 and 10 months olds are already showing racial bias. That must be born with anti-Black biases or anti-Chinese biases or anti-white biases. The answer actually is no. We studied the newborns. As soon as they are born, there's no racial biases at all with them. By about 3 months of age, after exposed to own race faces extensively for the last 3 months, they start to prefer to look at own race faces to other race faces. And then by about 9 months of age, they can only recognize, but however, at 6 months of age, they can recognize own race faces and other race faces without any difficulty. By about 9 to 10 months of age, babies start to lose the ability to recognize other race faces. So they start to treat other race faces as if they all look the same. But they maintain the ability to discriminate and recognize own race faces. So the answer to the question is that the reason is not we are biologically predisposed to be anti-Black, anti-Chinese, anti-white. No, but because the experience we have provided our babies are very limited, very homogeneous. So as a consequence, then babies start to show these biases at a very young age. Now, and we have developed some methods, just like the Harvard project, to test children's implicit and explicit racial biases. I'm not going to talk about how exactly it's done. So basically, now we have methods you can use to test implicit and explicit racial biases of your kids, and as young as 3 years of age. But what I do want to show you, so this is an implicit racial bias test. And I don't have time to talk about this, so you can ask me later about how we do it. But you should try on the Harvard website. And we basically modeled after their methods. But I want to show you something that is totally astonishing to me is the next one, the explicit racial bias measures. So this is a typical explicit racial bias measures we give to participants, children as young as 3 years of age. We say this summer your mother will take you to a swimming class. In the class, you could choose one person to teach you how to swim. Whom would you like to choose? And the majority of the kids would pick their own race individuals. So that is a Chinese face. They wouldn't pick the African-looking person as their coach. And this seems to be applied to many situations. Teacher, who you want to choose as teacher, as a doctor, etc., etc. So the children as young as 3 years of age have very strong biases to pick someone they're familiar with, mostly people from their own race, even though these individuals are someone they are not familiar with. Just keep that in mind as well, okay? So, so this is, then you ask, what about Canada? So our Canadian kids are less racially biased? Well, the answer probably is not. So you can say attitude towards Blacks. These are the Canadian children from about 3 years of age to about 12 years of age. So there's a very strong bias against Blacks, but the strongest one, of course, is among white kids, And then Asian kids also show strong anti-Black biases, and the South Asian and mixed race children and students under 12 years of age also have strong implicit racial biases against Black people in Canada. Okay, this is in Toronto. We collect data in Toronto. And then in explicit racial bias, as we can see, that the white children, Asian children, and South Asian and mixed race children tend to have strong anti-Black biases. So these are the kids as young as 3 years of age. So the bias is very strong at a very young age. So the question is how we can deal with this. We discovered, so the people have tried various methods to counter these biases. So let me give you one example, because this is a work done by a professor from McGill University. She spent her whole life doing this, because what she discovered was in Quebec, she did most of the study. When you give children books to read, children only pick books that are with their own race individuals on the cover. They don't want to read the books from other race individuals with cover depicting other race individuals. So then she would teach children to try these books about other race individuals. And then even children learned, they actually enjoy the stories, and then that was very good. And then the bias will be gone in the next few days. But a few weeks later, when she came back to the preschool classrooms, the children's bias would return. So she tried all sorts of ways throughout her entire career. Nothing lasted. So we said, this is not good. We have to start early and we should do something different. So one of the things that we have done is actually to teaching children to recognize other race individuals. So we don't tell them about race. We teach them, we ask them to basically learn the names of different other race individuals. So we ask them to recognize, for example, the Black individuals by their names. And then we give them a test until they remember these 5 people's names very, very well. And then we test their implicit racial bias. And to our surprise, which is in about, after about 20 minutes of teaching, learning about 5 Black faces, the Chinese, in this case, the Chinese children's racial bias dropped down significantly. But then about a week later, their racial bias came back. These are implicit racial biases. So then we say, okay, let me give you one more 20 minutes training. Just remember these 5 Black faces. And once they do that, you can see right away, their racial biases would reduce to 0. Implicit racial bias reduced to 0. Then we say, okay, how long will this last? So we waited for about another 30-something days. So that in total, about 47 days, we give them another test. The implicit racial bias against Blacks actually come back, but then do not come back to the level that about 47 days ago. So it seemed to us, teaching children to learn about other race individuals and their names not only help children to remember people's faces, but also have the benefit of reduce somewhat their implicit racial biases. And another method that people have used, and we are using as well, is actually bring a other race individual to come to face-to-face interaction with children. And turns out this really has immediate impact on children's biases against this individual. So that this Chinese girl immediately had developed very positive feelings about this other race adult. And also they reduced the implicit racial bias and explicit racial bias right away. However, and then you wait for a month or later, you come back, all that positive feelings as well as the biases, the original bias will come back. So this direct interpersonal interaction seems to be working immediately, but that does not last for some reason. So we don't know why, but so the people have spent millions and millions of dollars on this in the United States. And sometimes they create camps for mixed race camps in the United States every single summer for the last 20 some years now. And none of these camps actually produce lasting racial bias reduction effects, okay? So another one that has been shown to be quite effective is this. So this is actually a very important one. And so this is basically, it's called the counter stereotype exemplars. That the idea is sometimes your exposure to your environment to give you a sense certain race individuals are good at doing certain things, and certain race individuals are good at doing certain other things. However, if you give children exposure to people, for example, when I say nurse, immediately in your head, you say a female, but there are many male nurses as well. So if I show you more male nurses, that would counter your stereotype and therefore reduce your implicit and explicit racial biases. And in this case, they will be talking about positive examples like James is a firefighter, or James is a doctor, or James is a police officer, James is a scientist. And by learning many examples of atypical stereotype or counter stereotype exemplars would reduce children's implicit and explicit racial biases. But we still don't know how long this kind of effect will last. So one study we have done recently is telling us that this would last for at least about 90 days. So we haven't done anything beyond 90 days. So finally, this is something I really want to do. I would like to collaborate with TDSB is this. So we discovered that if we can use the 10-15 minutes daily physical activity time to teach children how to be active, but at the same time, we can reduce their racial biases. So this is what this experiment we did in China as well. So we asked children to follow these other race individuals when they are performing various physical activities. And the children have to mimic what they do. And then they have to learn who they are. And by doing so, the children learned who they are. They can recognize their faces. They know what, they have developed positive feelings towards them. They also learn to do various physical activities, exercises. And on top of that, their racial bias against Black people in China, these are the preschoolers, reduces significantly, both in terms of implicit and explicit racial biases. So I think this method probably, to me, I'm very hopeful that I can try it out in Canada or in different parts of the world to see whether or not this method can work in many parts of the countries, as well as whether or not this training effect can last more than 90 days. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm not sure about anyone else on the line, but I have so many questions for you, Dr. Lee.
Yeah.
But I'm going to so many questions. You've piqued me, but this is why I really wanted to invite you, because when I started taking a look at your research, I was quite intrigued in terms of what your findings were, and started exploring your site. And I thought it would be fascinating to have our family caregivers across the district hear what you have to say and share with us what your findings were in your research. So Floydine, we're going to move directly to our next speaker. So Floydine, did you want to introduce Dr. Smile? Is she still with us?
I am still with you. I could introduce myself.
No, no, you will not. No.
I couldn't fix it shorter.
If Floydine cannot, I will introduce you. No. So all those on the phone, it is a privilege for me to introduce to you Dr. Sharon Smile. She's the development pediatrician with Holland Blower View Kids Rehab Hospital. Dr. Smile's research interest is in identifying new model of care to address feeding challenges in children and youth diagnosed with autism spectrum. And she's also got some incredible insights and perspectives into the conversation around racialization and trauma of children. Dr. Smile, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you
welcome,
so
Dr.
much.
Smile. I'm sorry, it took me a while to get off mute. So welcome.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the invitation. I had slides, but I'm getting old, so I kind of saved them over something else. So I apologize. So I'll use my voice instead as a vehicle to have that conversation. I just want to say I was really impressed with Dr. Lee's work, and I learned a lot from his presentation. And I'm going to shift a bit regarding the conversation piece. I'm going to give you the lived experience and what my experience is in clinics speaking to families with kids who may have a disability. I'm a developmental pediatrician, as I said before, so I work a lot with families with kids who are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, but also from racialized groups. And I'm bringing the perspective as a physician. So when we look at racism in itself and having those discussions with clients within the hospital walls, one thing that I start out by saying to many families is that it's a biologically meaningless term, right? Because from a genetic perspective, we're probably 99.9% similar. And so race is, as defined previously by Dr. Lee and others, a social construct. It was something that was created to oppress, for one social class to oppress another social class. So we may look differently, but from a genetic perspective, we're very much same. And when we look at racism in itself, it does impact health. And this is very important for parents, because along that childhood lifespan, from infancy all the way up to adulthood, the impact of racism is very real. And it's identified as what's called a socially transmitted disease by the American Academy of Pediatrics because of its impact on health. We know that it's one of the social determinants of health, which is similar to poverty, housing, immigration, childhood health equity, insecurity. So it's something that we should, as physicians, have these daily or these conversations with families when they come in. And when we are talking about racism and I speak to families, I'm not only speaking to families who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. I'm speaking to everyone, because we're all part of this construct, right? And interconnected. And I think for Dr. Lee, when he went through some of the strategies that we use or that's used in research to figure out how do we slay this beast of racism, we recognize that probably some strategy lasts for a short period of time, but not having these long-term effects. And it's because we're all in this together, right? Not coining the term for COVID-19, but truly as a human race, we're all interconnected. And so it will take all of us to address this issue. But from my health perspective, why is it important for me as a physician to have these conversations with my families? One, we know that racism creeps up or manifests even from antenatal care, where we have health disparities or birth disparities seen in adults who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color, having premature births or higher infant mortality rates. So it's starting from early, right? And then we also see the impact of racism on mental health, especially amongst our kids with anxiety, poor self-esteem. That starts from early childhood and creeps up into adolescence, and depression, as well as just who do I talk to, right? Feeling alone, feeling isolated, and these can be manifested in many different ways. When I look at racism in itself, as well as health, I look at it from early childhood. We look at our own systems here in Canada, where we have 40% of our persons who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color represent kids who are in our CAS system, right? They're removed from their homes, whether or not it's protective or unprotective environment, but that separation in itself tells us that something is happening. We also look at kids who drop out of school, right? Where we have kids who are persons of color 2 times more likely to not complete high school. And why is this? And when you go deeper, you find that racism is a factor, right? The language and the vocabulary that we use and how the stereotypes that we place on kids will impact on their academic journey and education success. And this is important because education is one of the positive prognostic factor of future success. So if you're finishing high school, especially studies coming out of the States, persons with a college degree are more likely to live longer, have better lives, and less chronic illnesses. So if that's the case, if we have many of our kids who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color not completing school, not having a degree, then they're more likely to be using our healthcare system often. And probably as well, lack of access to appropriate healthcare system is even going to make them more disadvantaged. Now, for me, again, in speaking to families, I look at explaining racism. How do I talk to my child about racism? Because that's the topic of today's discussion. And there is no one solution, there's no one way. And because racism, as Dr. Lee says, is, well, it changes across the lifespan, right? We know that kids, within that first year, they're able to identify different color cues, so they can recognize what's similar, what's different. And so as a developmental pediatrician, I tend to use a developmental lens across the lifespan to figure out, how do I open this discussion? I tell parents that the discussion has to start from antenatal. You have to prepare yourself as well prior to having that child. How am I going to commit to an environment which is supportive, which is positive, which has positive vocabulary and empowerment? Because I know that when that child is in the environment, there are many factors that I can't control. So it is a factor of trying to protect, but also to prepare. So if I look at kids, and I'm speaking now to families with kids who are in these preschool years, so that 0 to 3 years of life, I look at the type of development, where are they at, how would they understand race and racism? And we know that for kids who are 1 to 2 years of age, they're starting to be aware of themselves. They're starting to interact with others within their own social or cultural rule system, right? So they see their parents, they look similar, and depending on what they're eating, what they're wearing, holidays that they're enjoying, they start taking on that type of identification. And they're curious about physical characteristics. So they want to look at hair differences, color of the skin, clothing that you're wearing, gender. And so they're trying to match people based on physical characteristics. So as such, when I'm looking at strategies to start that conversation about race, I'll say, let's start ensuring that there's access to other persons of different ethnicity, right? Which means that you don't just have friends who are Black, right? You don't just have friends who are of the same ethnic group. It's fun. You could if you go to church, let's say if we look at our church system here as well, if I go to, and try not to stereotype, a Caribbean Pentecostal church, there's gonna be a significant particular group of ethnic group that's similar. So there's an homogeneous group in that respect. So I'll challenge the parent to say, hey, do something different, where you'll be exposing your child to another person of a different ethnic origin, so that they see that there's another possibility. And use that in your library. Have a home library, bring books in that has different ethnic groups as well, so that you're starting that preparation and as well as that awareness early on. Now I speak to my families with kids who are 3 to 4 years of age. That's a very dangerous age group. Why? Because these are like that preschool year, right? And at that stage, kids recognize differences and similarities. So they know differences. I am darker, that person is lighter, or that person looks very much like what I see on TV. Disney dolls, right? Disney queens, that's princesses. That's what I look like, and that's what I'll represent. So because kids at this age understand racial physical characteristics, sometimes they're not really sure why that child is darker color or why that child is lighter color. So this gives us the opportunity to start those discussions and starting using positive vocabulary or words, so that that child will then imitate that type of language when they're having conversations with others as they get older. Please note that media is very, very important. It impresses upon our kids, right, a lot of different messages that you may not even be aware of. So is that implicit bias, right? So they're getting all these cartoon characteristics or movies that a positive image is only placed with a person who is Caucasian, and a negative image is the bad guy is always Black. The Black guys all gets killed off first in a horror movie, right? So that those types of messages are starting to be embedded in kids. Excuse me. And so it is important for families to be aware of what is your child watching, right? What message is being delivered? And this is where you start either reprogramming or avoiding those types of exposures, or having a discussion and saying, that's not right. Esther could, this Disney princess could be Black, or she could be brown, whatever, or indigenous, and start having those conversations from early, because the world is already imprinting that on your child's brain. So it's important to know that. When we look at kids who are going into grade 1, so we're looking at our 6-year-olds, they're really smart because now they understand, they're internalizing this idea of superiority or oppression because they've been living through this, right? Whether or not they have this immediate interaction and intimate interaction of either being oppressed or seeing that they're favored because they're picking it up in JK already and SK. So by the time they at grade 1, they recognize that power difference. And they also tend to feel, they explore their own self as well as group identity. And so you may see them having friends that are similar to them, right? So they feel safer in that type of group. And this is where we start hearing a change in language, where name calling, right? Using that stereotypical language is going to be more prominent. And they may have comfort in that group where they feel secured in saying it because everyone else is saying it. It's also important to know that, again, they recognize similarities as well as differences. So when you have a 6-year-old or grade 1 SK kid, again, talking about similarities and differences and not making differences being something negative. Because when we always talk about differences, it seems like less than or negative, but a difference could be just another way of seeing things or another way of doing something. And so accepting another way is important. I am originally from Jamaica, so I used to watch television and thought Christmas was Santa Claus with a fireplace and snow falling, and it was fabulous, and we could have hot tea or hot chocolate. Then I came to Canada. That's not Christmas. No, Christmas is trying to get a plane out of here to Jamaica, right? So that's my own bias, right? And again, where did I learn this? Where did I learn this? I learned this from watching television, seeing it being displayed as this lovely experience, which it is for the most part. But there's another option, right? Or another way of looking at it. And it's having these discussions with your kids, saying that different does not equal bad, but different equal another option, right? And then if you start challenging these definitions or words that we use and try to figure out what's driving that behavior, then when you're having the talk, it's not something that happens at teenage or adolescent. The talk happens from your child is looking at you, right? So we're talking about preschool years. Then we go to the tricky grade 2 going up to when you're age 9. What will be different about these kids? They can have a lot of critical thinking, right? So they're stopping and trying to figure out, what's happening? Why is Johnny being treated different? Or Michael is being treated different from Suzanne? Why is it? And they're picking up that the color of their skin, their accent, where they're from, the way they dress, drives that differential type of presentation or treatment. So being disadvantaged is if you look like Johnny, you're less likely to get your teacher giving you stars versus not. So that understanding happens. And at 9 years of age is a very tricky year because research has shown that their kids' racial identity and attitudes are quite fixed at age 9, and it tends to follow into adolescent. And unless they're like experiencing some significant life-changing experience, those attitudes tend to follow them into adolescent. So if at age 9, kids are already rigid in the way that they're labeling stereotypes, that means that we have to start from before that, right? And so that is in our experiences, those lived experiences, teachable moments, having that dialogue and vocabulary that is open, positive, and ascribing positivity to your own ethnic group as well as others. Then we go to the older kids, which is the kind of tricky kids, these preschoolers, pre-adolescent, sorry, always mixing them up. What's different with pre-adolescent? Here, they're like your justice warriors, right? This is where they're evolving because they see injustice and they're this is wrong, mom. No, this is wrong. We have to change it. And they don't see the limitation that the world puts on them, right? Because they think they can change that. They'll change climate change. They'll have positivity through politics, through laws, and this is amazing. But we also have to protect them, right? Because not everyone will be on that bandwagon. But here, kids are very concerned about injustices, and they're looking for an outlet in which to express how can they change their environment. They're also interested in history and geography at this time, so they're going to do their own research. Social media is available to them, their libraries are available to them, and they're going to try and figure out why this is wrong, right? And so as a parent, you have to be open for that discussion. And so it's important, especially in these pre-adolescent age group, they're very, very good at picking up when they're adults or when the adults or authoritative figure is not being fair, right? So this is where we're going to have these arguments at school with the teacher, right? Who is talking but not walking, or with you as a parent who is talking but not walking the talk of equity, diversity, and inclusivity. So this is where we have that adolescent tangling with that parent or pre-adolescent. So be prepared for that. And because it will be a discussion that you will have, it's important that you arm yourself with information. And then for the last group, adolescent into adulthood. Remember, development is dynamic, it's never ending. And so with each lived experiences, one then try to figure out, why is this happening? Okay, I did really well, but it happens again. Okay, I'm following all the rules, but it happens again. I didn't do anything wrong, Mom, but he looked at me, it happened again. So it's again, trying to equip your child with strategies in which to deal with life experiences where there's no rhyme or reason, where they may be victims of racism, but they may also be perpetrators, or they may be observers, right? So we have to prepare them with strategies in which to apply whenever they fall into either of those categories. For me, when I speak to parents as to have the conversation or the talk, I say to them, first, you have to do some introspection. Sit and think about your own biases, right? Don't have that blind spot where you think everyone else has a bias except me. And doing that implicit bias testing through Harvard is really an important one. It could be eye-opening, and anyone can do it, as Dr. Lee had spoken earlier. But stop and be ready for that discussion, right? Because it's going to be painful. You're going to cry. You're going to go, I don't know what to say. But remember that this discussion is ongoing, right? And it's also a journey that you take along with your child, right? And be open.
Smile, I'm going to ask if you can hold it there.
Oh, hey.
And we will.
Sorry, I'm Jamaican. I keep talking a lot.
Get to our final panelist. And you're going to have an opportunity to continue that conversation.
Okay, brilliant.
We hope we'll be able to do that during the Q&A. So what we wanted to do now, Dr. Shaw, if you could just hang with us, we just wanted to do a quick musical interlude break. So people will have the opportunity to just get up and stretch. And then we're just going to do a couple seconds, and then you will be immediately on next. All right? So just prep, Latha, let's just give people a little musical interlude, get up and stretch, do what you need to do, and we'll be back in about 3 minutes. Have we lost our music, Latha?
It might seem crazy what I'm about to say. Sunshine, she's here, you can take a break. I'm a hot air balloon that could go to space. With the air, like I don't care, baby, by the way. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like a room without a roof. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like happiness is the truth. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you know what happiness is to you. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like that's what you want to do. Here come bad news talking this and that. Well, give me all you got and don't hold it back. Well, I should probably warn you, I'll be just fine. No friends to you, don't waste your time. Here's why. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like a room without a roof. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like happiness is the truth. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you know what happiness is to you. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like that's what you want to do. Hey, go. Bring me down. Can't none bring me down. Your love is too high. Bring me down. Can't none bring me down. I said, tell you now. Bring me down. Can't none bring me down. Your love is too high. Bring me down. Can't none bring me down. I said, clap along if you feel like a room without a roof. Clap along if you feel like happiness is the truth. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you know what happiness is to you. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like that's what you want to do. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like a room without a roof. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like happiness is the truth. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you know what happiness is to you. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like that's what you want to do. Hey, go. Bring me down. Can't
Thank you. I hope you
Yeah.
had an opportunity, everyone, to just get up and stretch a bit. We just know that some of these Zoom chats, sometimes you're sitting for a while. So we hope you got a moment to stand up, stretch a bit. And why don't we, Latha, would you take your slide out so Dr. Shaw can get set up? Bloody, did you want to take the intro or did you want me to do so?
Sure, I'm fine with doing that. Thank you. And thank you to the speakers before. I too have questions, Michelle. So Dr. Vidya Shah is the assistant professor, leadership and education at the Faculty of Education at York University. And I know she's gonna also have some very informative things to say. So welcome, Dr. Shah.
Leadine, thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you for the invitation to be here today. Dr. Lee and Dr. Smile, it's so great being in conversation with you and learning from you. I think, I was just thinking as you were both speaking that I think how we set up this evening is actually quite lovely. So Michelle, thank you to you for your leadership on this. I want to begin by saying that I am a teacher, a former teacher in the TDSB, very proud. I am currently a teacher educator at York University, so I work with practicing teachers. And I talk a lot about race. I talk a lot about race in the various classes that I teach, both undergraduate and graduate. And you know, I think it's important for me to also begin by saying that to sort of position myself in this discussion. So I identify as brown or South Asian. My mother from Trinidad and Tobago, my father from Zanzibar, East Africa, all ancestors from India. I'm second generation. I'm also what I identify as a South Asian woman living on Turtle Island as a colonized settler. And I say that because I think it's important to locate where we are and what this means. And I think about, you know, my family's histories of colonization in various ways. The intergenerational trauma that we are still working through as a family, the ways in which the internalized messaging that Dr. Smile was talking about and Dr. Lee was talking about lives on in us. And I'm also very conscious of the fact that I'm on this land as a settler on this land. And I think about what that means about my responsibility to this land, what that means in terms of my responsibility to standing in solidarity with Indigenous communities here, with standing in solidarity around water protection and land protection movements, standing in solidarity around supporting self-governance and self-determination for Indigenous communities here, recognizing my responsibilities as a treaty person on this land. So much of that informs how I think about conversations around race, and to sort of make that distinction between racism and decolonization, which are two separate pieces, although interconnected. So I share with you today as well, and I want to thank Floydine for naming DeFonte Miller. You know, we are in a time of global uprising, global racial uprising, in a way that I don't know that we've seen before. And there's a tremendous amount of sadness and grief. There's a tremendous amount of pain and trauma. And there's a tremendous amount of something is emerging. Something is emerging in us as a collective to speak up and stand back and challenge and disrupt racism. And you know, this notion of this problem of anti-racism is something that's down south of the border, and we don't have it here. I mean, today's verdict around the case of DeFonte Miller is a perfect example of the fact that we in Canada here in Toronto, we are seeing much greater state-sanctioned violence against Black and Indigenous communities. Tanya Talaga wrote an article a couple of days ago saying that in the last couple of months, 6 Indigenous people have been killed at the hands of police. And so this is us. This is us in Toronto and in Canada. And we need to start from that basis. Start from the basis that we have a legacy of cultural genocide. There's continued genocide on this land. We have a legacy of anti-Black racism that exists in every single institution that we operate in, from policing to healthcare, as Dr. Smile was sharing, to education. And I'm seeing quite a few comments on the chat box about that and the ways in which it plays out in education. So today I'm speaking to this notion of, you know, speaking to brown parents about, you know, talking to your kids about race. And I position myself because to me, identity is so important. Race and racism, what it does to our students, what it does to us as human beings is it dehumanizes us. And so the purpose of conversations like today is to think about, what would education systems look like? What would our homes look like? What would our society look like if every child and every person was affirmed, felt safe, had their rights met? What would our society look like then? So this conversation about speaking to our kids about race and racism is actually a conversation about humanization and liberation. What does it mean to create systems in which we can all come into our own, all be humanized? That's what today's conversation is about. And so as a brown person or a South Asian person, I recognize how complex identity is. And I recognize how I'm read in the world. And I recognize how I'm complicit, meaning that I participate in anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism and uphold white supremacy. So today's conversation is going to be about that, and it's going to be uncomfortable. And I'm glad that Michelle at the beginning shared the slide about what we do when we're uncomfortable, but I'm naming it again, that I'm going to say some things today that might be uncomfortable for us to hear. And you might disagree with it, and I encourage that discussion and discourse, because this is what today is all about. So just jumping in. Very briefly, when I say brown, you know, in the U.S. when they say brown, or even here in Toronto when some folks say brown, they're referring to Latinx communities as well. Today I'm speaking specifically to people of the South Asian diaspora. And so we might be talking about countries like India and Pakistan and Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, Nepal, the Maldives. We're talking about countries in the Caribbean. We're talking about countries in Africa. We're talking about countries in Europe in which the South Asian diaspora exists. And I want to also say that if you are on this call and you don't identify as brown, I want you to hear and think about the ways in which what I'm sharing here actually talks about sort of racial hierarchies and how racial positioning in hierarchies influences who we are, how we are read, what our options are in the world, ways in which we are dehumanized or humanized. And so when the reason I use the term brown, and this actually comes from a webinar that I did last Friday with Jiwan Chanaka and Dr. Harveen Singh in Dubai. And we talked about brown complicity. So in what ways are brown folks complicit or participating in upholding anti-Black racism? So this notion of brown really speaks to the fact that not all people who by census definitions are called South Asian would identify as brown, right? So many folks from the Caribbean or many folks from countries in Africa would not identify as South Asian. Many second, third, fourth generation folks here that, again, by census definitions would be considered South Asian, would not identify as South Asian. They would identify as brown. So brown to me is a political term. It's a contested term. It's a term that is used by particular people in particular ways. And so any of these terms, any of these categories are categories that are created for particular reasons, for political reasons at political times, or I'm sorry, at particular times, and are contested terms that we need to always be thinking about, right? I also want to say that, you know, among brown people, there's a lot of diversity. We are diverse in terms of our religion. We are diverse in terms of geopolitical connections. We are diverse in terms of place of birth, in terms of language, in terms of social class, in terms of caste, in terms of so many differences, right? So this is it's a very, like any racial group, a very dynamic, very complex grouping. And I say that because, you know, when we think about the experiences for some of the children in school that would identify as brown, while it's hard to kind of group those experiences into one, there are some patterns that we are noticing, right? There are some patterns that I noticed growing up. There are some patterns that I'm noticing in the students that I teach. There are patterns. And I think what's important is that, you know, a common experience of many sort of South Asian, Southeast Asian, East Asian students in schools is one of invisibility. We are largely invisible in school textbooks. We are largely invisible in the media. We are largely invisible in many institutions. And while that might be changing, we don't have many representations that we can look to. I think about, you know, there's the new Mindy Kaling show that came out, Never Have I Ever. And I think about how many brown women my age were tweeting about how important the show was to them, because we never had that kind of representation growing up ever. And of course, the show has lots of, you know, there's lots of complexities and there's lots of critiques around it. And I actually agree with many of those critiques, but the pull to being represented in the media and to have your stories, or even a version of your stories, represented on screen meant so much. And we can't underestimate the importance of that. And so this idea of being invisibilized, often living between two worlds, you know, there was always the Vidya growing up that was at school, and the Vidya that lived at home, and how those two people had to negotiate, you know, and in one space, maybe not brown enough, and in one space, maybe a little too brown, and having to negotiate how to switch identities between home and school. I think about the fact that, you know, so many of brown children. I think about the way that the media positions us as brown folks, and Dr. Smile spoke to this. But we're often positioned as this perpetual foreigner. We're always different. We're always on the outside. We're never actually Canadian. We're always different. We're always positioned in some sort of comical sense. There's often an accent, and that combined with that accent is this comical person. Many times we are raceless, so we just don't talk about race at all if we are positioned on screen. And then there's these stories of sort of rags to riches. You know, you have folks that are sort of living out the Canadian dream or whatever it might be. And this all links to the idea of the model minority. And the model minority is this idea that it's a myth, first of all. I need to say that. But the model minority myth was created in the 60s and 70s. And it was actually created to take attention away from the enslavement of Black people and replace it with this notion of, look at this group over here that's working really hard and making it. It must not be systemic racism that's the issue. It must be, you know, there's something inherently wrong with Black folks if they aren't able to do the same thing that brown folks are able to do. So this model minority myth of, you know, being the model group of what it means to be a minority, this came into play specifically to justify further enslavement and dehumanization of Black folks. And that's something that I never got taught growing up. I'm sharing this specifically today because there's an erasure in our curriculum. There's an erasure in the collective understanding of what these particular how they play out. And if we don't understand how the system of white supremacy works to create these myths, that we are inevitably going to be complicit in it. But the fact that we don't know about it is also intentional. Right? We're not supposed to know about it because then we might actually resist it. So this notion, you know, I say this often that I owe so much of my right to be here in Canada, my family's right to be here in Canada, to Black activists, to Black scholars, to Black communities, for my family's right to be here, right? And we don't know that history as well. It's also a history that gets erased. We think about, for example, in Canada, we had the Ontario Racial Discrimination Act of 1944, the Ontario Human Rights Code, the Employment Equity Act. These are all acts that occurred in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and were spearheaded by the activism of Black folks. And so very actually, me, my family, and folks that look like me owe our right to be here to Black activists. And that needs to be said really clearly. This model minority myth, what it does to us as whether it's brown folks or Southeast Asian folks or East Asian folks, is it lumps us all into one category. It makes the assumption that we are all doing well in school, that we're all good at math, that we're all good at science. I struggle with math, but that's a separate talk. But what it does is it lumps us all into this one category, and it's dangerous. It's dangerous because it does not account for the religious, cultural, geopolitical, sociopolitical, economic differences that exist among us. And what that does is that among South Asian or brown populations that require further help or support, we are often denied that, often not, we are invisibilized even in this assumption that we are all black. And we also benefit from the model minority myth, right? So here's the flip side of this, that this alignment to white supremacy, really, this alignment to whiteness has provided us with privilege, with access to power, access to education. And what it's done is it's sort of seeped into our mind this idea that we are sort of hardworking, non-threatening, submissive, eager to please, flexible people. And our presence as the model minority makes it easy to maintain the status quo. We make it easy to maintain these very different divides, racial divides, the treatment and justification accordingly. Right? There's this notion called honorary whites, and it's this idea that we are more likely to be accepted in white spaces as brown folks upon the condition that we continue to be passive, compliant, and constantly striving to attain wealth and whiteness, frankly. But the reality is that is not true. And the reality is there are many glass ceilings that we are working with. And the reality is when we look at Jagmeet Singh last week, who stood up in the House of Commons and he called out the Bloc Québécois leader or MP for being racist, and then refused to withdraw that comment, got kicked out of the House of Commons. So if we're talking about the official leader, the federal of the federal NDP party is not allowed to say that without there being repercussions, we are kidding ourselves if we're thinking as brown folks that we can just play the game to get somewhere. There are limits, and we need to recognize that, and we need to recognize that our job is to help subvert and deconstruct this racial hierarchy and our place in it. Here as well that, you know, anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity operates in many ways in brown communities. It operates in shadism, and this is directly linked to issues of caste. And so with shadism, it's this idea that more positive qualities are associated with lighter skin, beauty, social capital, social wealth, social mobility is all associated with lighter skin. Most recently, there's been this big movement to change the leading bleaching cream in India and actually in the South Asian diaspora that's called Fair and Lovely. So there's this big movement because it's considered anti-Black to rebrand it. And this is nonsense, because what they're rebranding is anti-Blackness. What they're rebranding is there's something wrong with darker skin, that what's associated with darker skin is lower social mobility, is you know, not being beautiful. That's what's associated with Blackness. And so instead of just stopping the production of the cream, they are now rebranding it as though somehow that's going to change things, right? So this is deeply seeped into many people of color and how we think about ourselves in terms of our aligning to whiteness physically, right? We think about this in terms of how we tell our children who we can be who they can be friends with, who they can date, who they can partner with, right? It shows up in that way. It shows up on where we choose to live. We want to live in the better neighborhoods. We want to live in the safer neighborhoods, and that's code for white neighborhoods, right? And so we need to be honest about that and say that this is in fact what's happening. It shows up as well in the ways in which we justify the mistreatment of Black and Indigenous people in Canada. Instead of recognizing the state-sanctioned violence that is directed at Black and Indigenous folks, you'll hear many brown people, not all, not me, not many members of my family, but some brown people you will hear saying, well, they deserve it. You know, it's part of their culture. If they just complied with the laws, this wouldn't happen. If they just, you know, cared more about schooling, they wouldn't get kicked out of school. These are the kinds of things that are said among many brown people, brown families, and this is what this does. Is it instead of understanding the socio-political and economic constructs that give rise to differences in access and opportunity, disproportionate outcomes for families and students in terms of health and education. Instead of understanding that, we blame people who are most oppressed in our society. We are complicit then. If we're doing that, we are complicit in maintaining white supremacy, and we are also complicit in maintaining anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity. So a lot of this comes down to what are the comments that we are making? What are the ways that we are making sense of this? You know, cultural appropriation, there's a lot of brown folks that are making money off of the cultural appropriation of Black culture. And it's just not okay, right? We think about the lack of knowledge here or the inaction, the fact that we can turn away, the privilege to turn away and not have to think about race and talk about race is indicative of the fact that we have aligned ourselves with whiteness, right? That we have aligned ourselves with this idea that we are benefactors of not having to talk about race. So I share this, I'll just share this last slide here. When we think about speaking to our kids about race and what that means, Dr. Smile spoke about this so clearly and in such an important way, that representation matters. In media and books, it matters. It matters that we see ourselves represented positively. I want to give a shout out to A Different Book List, which is a wonderful bookstore that sells books that represent a variety of identities and complex identities. Representation matters. So buying books, exposing our children to different people, especially people that are challenging the model minority myth, especially people that are not falling in line with what it means to be quote unquote brown in society, people that are exploring different jobs, different experiences in life. Representation matters. This notion of validation of complex lived experiences. Talking with your children, recognizing that they are navigating multiple worlds, recognizing that it's really hard to think about who am I at school and who am I at home, and why are those two different people? What about me is allowed to come alive in school, and what about me is allowed to come alive at home, and what space can actually hold both of those things, right? So thinking about the complexities and intersections in terms of gender identity, in terms of sexuality, in terms of social class, in terms of language, having these conversations with our kids. It also means, as Dr. Smile was saying, educating ourselves, really for us to learn alongside our children. We don't have to be the experts as the adults. We can work alongside our children and learn together. And this is where it's important. I'm a very proud auntie. I don't have children, but I'm a very proud auntie. And this is where it's important that we're talking families. We're talking families learning together, not just parents and children. We're talking about aunties and grandmas and grandpas and neighbors all coming together and learning together and building what we call a critical consciousness, being able to read the world, to be able to have direct conversations with our kids about race. There's often the misnomer that if I just don't talk to my kids about race, they're not going to grow up racist. That is the exact opposite of how things are playing out, right? We want to be able to speak to our children about race, to engage them in conversations at an early age, as both Dr. Lee and Dr. Smile mentioned, to normalize conversations about race, to normalize difference, as Dr. Smile was saying, that it's not, to be aware of when are we associating particular differences with negative connotations, deviance, criminality, uncivilized. When are we associating particular differences with positive qualities and breaking that, working through that with our children? And this is a really important piece, especially as folks that are sort of like the people of color group, the POC group, not the BI, but the POC. So for the POC group, the people of color group, to think about our complicity in this, to think about the ways that we are upholding this, to think about the fact that if we're choosing not to speak about, why dark skin is considered ugly in South Asian communities, that's actually anti-Blackness, right? To think about the fact that if we aren't having these conversations in our families, then our families in part are upheld by anti-Blackness and anti-Indigeneity. That's part of what brings them together. And we need a new definition of family and a new definition of solidarity and a new definition of culture that doesn't engage that. And finally, just to share here the importance of speaking with your children about how to see the world, how to see who might not belong, who might be excluded, who might not be safe, who might feel uncomfortable, and why. So to develop the lens to see that, and then to develop the skills to intervene, to ask a question, to redirect, to call it straight out and say, this, I don't agree with this because this sounds racist to me. To model that behavior with our children so that they see what that looks like. For them to see us doing it with neighbors, with family members, with coworkers, because they are watching. They are watching everything you do. And so this really, at the end of the day, is about how do we come home to ourselves as humans, as people that are all looking towards liberation and humanity, and what that means in terms of what our role is as a collective. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Shaw. I'm now taking a look at the time. It's 8:06. And so I'm going to take moderators' liberties right now and just ask my audience if you could just hang there with us just for 5 more minutes. Could you just drop me a couple of yeses? We're doing okay in the chat, so I know that you can stay with me just for a few more minutes because there are a couple questions that came through that I want to pose to the panelists. Okay, great. I'm seeing some yeses absolutely coming through. So that's fabulous. So the first one is going to Dr. Lee. Dr. Lee, one of the questions asked in the chat was, do mixed families have the same issues, questions, concerns? Did you do anything, find out anything done in your research? Go ahead.
There's a very limited research about this. However, and there's evidence to suggest that if you are exposed early on to diverse environments, including mixed race families, you tend to have much reduced racial biases, not only against these two groups, let's say father's race, mother's race, but also beyond that. So the early diversity seems to be very, very important to children. And the linguistic diversity is also very important. If you hear many, many languages, and that will also not only allow you to learn more languages, but also allow you to have reduced racial biases. So that I think creating a diverse environment in your family and in your immediate environment or schools, that would make the child less biased in many ways.
Okay, thank you for that. The next question, Dr. Smile. There are a couple who wanted to have you please provide your examples as to how do you talk to teens about race?
Yeah, they're a difficult group, but because of their, and that's a really good question. Can you hear me? Yes, yeah, okay. Because of their cognitive skills, they have a lot of reasoning skills. And I tell parents, this is where you have that real talk, right? Not trying to hide, not trying to cover things up. They're wiser than you think. And they've lived experiences where they may not have divulged to you. And I always ask parents to reflect back, give an example of your own life where you were impacted by racism or that was part of your journey, and dissect it with your child, right? And have that discussion. I am a strong believer of starting with family. it's surprising to me when we look amongst our BIPOC population that another ethnic group can just relate all their grandfathers, great-grandfathers, where they lived, what they did, their occupation. And we as a people tend not to go past your first or second generation. So I challenge families to go in deeper and do your own family tree, your own family history, right? And it is, when it comes to adolescence, apart from books, apart from lived experience, go to a museum that talks about Black history and walk through that museum with your child and talk about it. And you'll recognize that you are also ignorant of many things. So this is a lifelong journey where you're learning. And in the moment, if you see your adolescent displaying biases, check them on it and talk through it. I think in the chat, someone spoke about my kid is on a computer game and they're cursing and using different words. How do I address that? And I'll tell parents that you've got to be real with your kids and then do some role reversal. What if you spoke to your child using that type of language? Let them walk through that experience and see how they feel and what the negative impacts could be because of that. And what if that happened outside of the home environment, what would result into that? And there's a good documentary that's called Screenagers, I think, that walks through what are the challenges of prolonged video gaming, and sit down and watch it with your child and have that discussion with your adolescent.
So the next question is one I'm going to put out to all three panelists. Either of you may answer it, and I'm going to read it directly. Do adopted children in a mixed household accept the ethnicity of the parent that is not, let me rephrase that, accepts the race of the parent that is not their race as their preferred race?
I have an answer to this question. People have done studies in France because at one point the French parents adopt a lot of Korean kids. And when Korean kids came to the villages, the French villages, they eventually actually develop biases against the Asians, just like in their environment, because they are not looking at themselves in the mirror, but they're looking around in their family and their environment, and that's where they pick up these cues and they identify with the people around them, and therefore they develop biases against Koreans, for example.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to pitch in that, or go ahead, Dr. Shaw?
So I'll just say that, identity is complex and it's fluid and it changes with context and space and time. And I think it's really important for parents with children that are adopted to help them in coming into their own and what that means about various identities that they might hold. It's not necessarily one identity. They might relate to various identities. It's also really important to help them recognize how they are going to be read in the world. Because as much as they might be in a family that is not of their race, they're going to be read in the world a particular way, and to develop the consciousness to understand what those particular ways might be, how you might navigate that. Encouraging your child to be in close proximity to people who also identify that way, who can speak to them, who can mentor them, who can talk to them about what their experiences have been. I think it's really important to allow children and encourage children to connect with how they identify in the world and how other people are going to read them in the world. And that means a lot of conversations around identity and it changing and being fluid.
I agree. I'll just resonate what both speakers stated. And it's again going back to protect versus prepare. It's a combination of both, because you can have a loving home environment, but when you step out that door, right, it may look totally different. So if you have a child who's adopted, not of your ethnicity or from the country which they're living, learn about where they were adopted from, right? Learn about their customs and cultures so that you equip them with that knowledge and strategy to deal with it when they're going to be faced in the world with biases.
So hearing you clearly that all families need to be talking race, whether you are homogeneous Black, whether you are brown, whether you are Asian, whether you are mixed, that we all have a responsibility as the adult or that significant adult in their lives to be having a race conversation. But Dr. Lee, we're going to go back to something you said in your presentation, that if children are not learning biases from their caregivers, where are they getting it from? And what kind of, you had mentioned some intentional strategies about physical education. One of the comments that came through was, did the physical activity of a racialized person leaving an activity feed into a bias that already exists about the perceptions of racialized people and physical activity? So I'll leave those two with you.
Yes, I will address the first question first. So the kids get these ideas, just like Dr. Smile said, it's from media and from their immediate environment and from the schools and the people they interact with. So if we construct our environment as parents in a very homogeneous way, your kids are bound to be biased. Just tonight, go home, go through your books that they have bought for your kids. Look at the toys you have bought for your kids. Look at the dolls you have bought for your kids. See whether or not they are actually of diversity or just they are really very similar to what your own experience is. Look at the movies and the programs, the TV programs that you're watching, and you together with your kids. You look at them. Are they about people of your own race or about a different race? If you take a look at that, very quickly you realize your construction of your environment is very limited, most of us. So that's, I think this is one important thing. And then I want to address the other one. So people actually have criticized us for physical activity. The reason we do physical activities and using, in China, people actually don't make this assumption about Black people being athletic. And this is a notion possibly in Canada or in the US, but not in China. So, but the idea is actually that we want kids to learn from this adult, learn this person's names, not the person's race. We never mention the racialized label. We just ask, learn James. James is going to teach you how to do exercise. This person could be a white person, could be a South Asian person, doesn't matter. The idea is for children to learn to individual this person, to think this person as an individual, not as a group label. So one of the things I really want to tell everybody based on my own research, before 6, 7 years of age, you shouldn't refer to someone on the street by their racialized labels, but you have to refer to the person as an individual. Once you treat each person as an individual, your child actually learns that. And the children themselves, before 6, 7 years of age, even though they have a notion of race, but they don't, when they encounter a person, they hardly ever actually treat the person as a Black person, Chinese person, Asian person. It's the way adults actually give them these labels. And then they attach to it. So when they see some individual of not their own race, what first thing came to their mind, instead of oh, this is Johnny, this is Michael, this is Jennifer, it becomes, oh, this is Black, Asian, and Chinese. So I think, before 6 or 7 years of age, I think I would encourage our parents, not when you encounter a individual of other ethnicity, not using racialized labels. But after, I totally agree with Dr. Smile, after 6, 7 years of age, when kids have more developed cognitively and socially as morally, then you can introduce these kind of ideas to them. But before that, kids actually living a very egalitarian kind of world, and you would be surprised to see this. But this is how I saw when I do our studies. Kids do not racialize other kids in their classroom until adults put the label towards them. And then kids start to realize there are race differences.
Okay, thank you for that. There is a very specific question where you're being asked if there is time, is the term racial bias being equated with racism? Dr. Shah, is that one you'd like to take?
Sure, I'll jump in. So racial bias is often a preference, right? There's a preference in a particular direction. There might be a negative preference or a positive preference, but it's more sort of in the realm of preference. When we talk about racism, we're talking about attaching to that structural, historical constructs that that lead to differences in power, right? And so racism is the differences in how people in power, in economics, in social capital as a result of the race that you belong to. So this added element of power to be able to determine who has access and opportunity is the separate element of racism that isn't there necessarily with racial bias. So racial bias can happen in multiple ways, but racism is specifically it's equated with power. And so white folks would having the power within a racial group, that would be considered racism.
And Michelle, may I comment
Thank
briefly?
you.
Sure.
Please.
Yes, and I think to add to what Dr. Shaw said, racism comes with a level of pain that an impact on people's mental, emotional, and physical health in a way that it may not be seen through racial bias, and lends itself to continuing trauma, traumatization of people, I would say, in terms of how it has an impact. You can feel it. You could almost taste it, and therefore people have a physical, emotional, or mental response to it, I would say, and even spiritual.
I agree. Thank you so much for sharing that, Foydeen.
Dr. Lee, go ahead.
I would comment on this. So racism to me is an ideology. It's an ideology that basically dehumanizes other races and in favor of your own races or in favor of certain race against others. So this, and then it's sometimes can be institutionalized and then built the social hierarchy. So certain humans are better than other humans. So, but the racial biases, however, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, involves three aspects: attitude, prejudice, and the stereotypes, and discrimination. So you may not discriminate in your behavior against other race individuals, but you may have some stereotypes. So I think a majority of the people in the world would have some form of racial bias, but they may not be racists. So I think, so that's an important distinction.
Thank you. I am noting the time, and our audience has been incredibly patient with us, and I want to extend my thanks to those of you who have stayed on the line. I also want to extend my thanks and appreciation to our distinct panelists. The hope for this conversation in putting it together was to create a space where we can begin to inform and educate our family caregivers across our district about how to be having these conversations. In my work, I hear a lot from family caregivers who say to me, Michelle, I don't want to talk race with my babies. They're too young, they're too little. Or I'm not going to have the conversation, Michelle, because I'm very concerned that I'm going to make them racist if I do. Or I don't like when we talk about this thing called race because it makes my children uncomfortable. I'm hoping today that you will walk away, right, with the understanding that it's essential. While we are not teaching our children this idea about implicit bias, there's a responsibility as the adult caregivers in their lives to be keeping an ongoing conversation with them about race and racism. I make the distinction, and I posed the question before. With our children, do we start a conversation about race, or do we start the conversation about racism, right? And we heard Dr. Lee say, well, you know, they're beginning to make distinctions real early with race, right? And that no baby is born with an implicit bias. That implicit bias develops as they grow and they grow. So what that essentially says for us as the adult is we may not teach it, but we have a significant role in an ongoing conversation. It's not a one-time conversation to say I've done it, because as our children are growing and emerging, it becomes an ongoing conversation. And I just want to reiterate real quickly some of the comments we heard in the strategies. I heard someone said, you know what, it's really essential that we do self-inquiry, that we begin with ourselves to get a sense of how are we, the adults, thinking, feeling about race, and are we comfortable You know, I read an article where a doctor said that if you are not comfortable with it, your children are going to see through that, right? And that you may want to be just open and honest in where you're at with it and begin the conversation from there. But please don't be afraid also to do some homework on yourself to get an understanding. There are a number of resources out there. As a matter of fact, you could just Google it. You could Google, how do I talk to my kids about race? And you would be surprised the amount of information that comes up. So I want to extend a thanks and appreciation to each of the panelists again. I want to actually take this personal opportunity to thank my team, Margaret, Horvath, Latha, John. You've just been instrumental in getting these 3 sessions up and going. I know you're exhausted and you're thrilled that we're at the end of it. So thank you for that. Associate Russell Rawlings, our Associate Director, I want to extend my appreciation for her in allowing us to create this space for this type of conversation. There's a question that says, what is the TDSB doing about ensuring that our curriculum is representative and reflective? I see Dr. Shaw is smiling. This is an ongoing committed work of our district, and that we continue to work with all staff to be able to build their capacity to do this in every school, every classroom across our district, to ensure that our students are being reflected and represented in their work. Are we there yet? Absolutely not. Does the work continue? Absolutely. And you know that it's a commitment because it's coming from the top, and we'll continue that work. So on that note, we are looking at doing more of these conversation series in the fall. So please look out for them. And that we have ongoing work to do and conversations to have. So we are having a survey. If you could just quickly just get that link and just provide us a quick feedback as to how you felt about the session, would really appreciate it. And, you know, Talking Race with Families, there are a list of resources that are available on the TDSB site. So please visit that link there and get the information that you need. All 3 of our conversations will also be posted on the Toronto District School Board site. And so please feel free at a later date, when you have some time, to just go and re-listen to the conversations. So my extended appreciation to Trustee Rachel Chernos-Link, thank you for hanging there with all 3 sessions with us. It's appreciated. I want to extend my thanks to the Parent Involvement Advisory Committees, our collaborators and partners in the work of engagement across our district. And I want to thank each and every one of the participants for spending your Friday evening with us. Please enjoy it. After you complete our survey, though, please complete our survey, then go enjoy your evening. Thank you again to our panelists, and everyone have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye.